I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan appointed New Jersey businessman Raymond J Donovan to his cabinet as Secretary of Labor, a position he served in until 1985. During his tenure, Donovan carried out Reagan's policies of advocating for free market by reducing government regulation in labor issues. Donovan's tenure as Secretary of Labor was marked by controversy. He was accused of having ties to organized crime, and in 1984, he was indicted on charges of larceny and fraud in connection with a construction company he had been involved with before his government service. However, after a lengthy trial, Donovan was acquitted of all charges in 1987. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we will be speaking with Donovan's son, Ken, who will give us insight into the life of his father, including his challenging start in life, his success as a businessman, his political prominence in the Reagan campaign, and his heart for his family and philanthropic causes. I'd now like to welcome Ken Donovan to our show. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
Well, Ken, as I prepared for this interview, I started to research your dad, Raymond James Donovan. And before I really got into the research too much, I started to try to search my own memory of your dad, and I realized that his name was kind of burned into my memory banks. The name had been, I'd heard it many times, but I was thinking, well, what do I know about the story? What do I remember about the story? I just remember he was on the news a lot. I was in my early to mid 20s. I was starting a family. I was starting my career. I sort of had a half an ear into the news and the rest on what I was doing. So as I started to research more and more, I saw that this was a really big deal, what was rolling out in the life of your dad and the life of your family back in the early to mid 80s. And it was just huge. It was just huge. We're going to get into all that. But as I read more about your dad, I realized that there was so much more to your dad's life, who he was, what he did, where he came from. And I thought, wow, what better way to really find out about the big piece of who Raymond Donovan was, but then to speak with his son. So we're really happy to have you on our show.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So why don't we start with your dad? Where your dad was born in New Jersey. Can you tell us about where he was born and tell us about his early years and his family?
Sure. So he was born in Bayonne, New Jersey, one of 12 children. He was, a little past on the older side of the middle of that group. So born in 1930, beginning of the depth of the Depression. My grandfather, whom I never met, you'll understand why, worked at a chemical factory in Bayonne called Bayway. And my grandmother was having kids, it seems. So he went to the local Catholic school, St. Andrew's School, was educated by the local priests and sisters. My grandfather died when he was 12. My grandmother died when he was 16. So the reason I never met them. And so in order to continue his education and also just by subtraction, have fewer mouths to feed in a house in the middle or toward the end of the Depression and during the war, he and two brothers ultimately got their education in Alabama in a seminary called Holy Trinity Seminary, which was run by the Trinitarians, the servants of the Most Holy Trinity, and received his education there. It would be the equivalent of a master's degree in philosophy. And about, say, a year before his final orders to become a priest, as we always like to refer to it, upon mutual agreement between my father and the seminary, he left. He was not. He had an enormous personality, and while always very spiritual throughout his life, very religious throughout his life, I think they both made the right choice.
A couple quick questions, if you don't mind. Did his parents die from accidents or illness? Must have been very young.
They were young, natural causes, cancer and heart, but they were young. I'm sure to some degree exposure to chemicals in my grandfather's case, in my grandmother's case, just unfortunate genes, I suppose.
Yeah, I figure working in a chemical factory in the 20s and 30s, what could go wrong, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right.
Yeah. And so he was able to travel, to go to school, though. How did he get the financing even to do that?
I think part of it was there was no financing. So because it was a seminary, it was a, quote, free education. And the reason he went and the reason my two uncles went, only one became a priest. So the education, it turned out to be a very good education, interesting experiences. He had tons and tons of stories from his time there, but also it allowed them to have a future as opposed to, I don't know what you would do as a 12-year-old or a 16-year-old for work back in those days, but I'm sure there wasn't a whole lot of work to be found.
Okay. Okay. So he decided not to go into the priesthood, and he finished his schooling. And then did he come back up to New Jersey then?
He did. So my father was a very proud New Jerseyan, and except for his time in Alabama, and then after he retired, spending much more time in Florida, he actually came back from Florida as well. New Jersey was in his roots, it was in his blood. He was always a Jersey guy. So he came back, started partly to help out the rest of the family. He was working, and some of the older siblings were taking care of some of the younger siblings, more in the after the war in the early 1950s, and went to work for a company called American Insurance Company in Newark, where he did construction bonding work. So when a construction company wants to bid on a public job, they need bonding, which is a completion guarantee. That's the insurance so that if the contractor can't complete the work, the municipality can find somebody and pay them with the insurance proceeds from the person who couldn't complete the work. So as dry as that is, which it's kind of funny if you knew my father that he was selling insurance, it's kind of bizarre. But he met my mother there, which was a great benefit to working at American Insurance Company. They got married in 1957. Also in 1957, he left American Insurance and joined one of his clients, a gentleman named Ron Schiavone. They became partners in Schiavone Construction Company, which they built from doing curbs and driveways to the seventh largest heavy construction company in the country.
Wow. So there must have been, first of all, one other question. Before your mom and dad got married, was your dad still helping out with his siblings?
He was, although many of the siblings at that point had either married or started their adult lives on their own. It was just the younger ones that were still in the house. Certainly was helping them, but one of the two younger was one of the others that went to seminary. So he was kind of out of the house.
Okay.
Yeah, there was help for a period of time, late 40s, early 50s.
Okay. So this gentleman from, is it Schiavone Construction? Is that the name of it?
Yep.
Okay. He must have seen something pretty special in your dad, because if I'm doing the math right, your dad was only in his 20s, mid-20s or something, right?
It was 27 years old, just short of his 27th birthday. Ronnie was an engineer, Dartmouth engineer, who understood how to build things. My father was the business side of that. He was the bonding, the finances. It was how his brain worked. So they made a very good pair together, and built a lot of roads, tunnels, highways, bridges in New Jersey, New York City, and the environs.
I've probably driven over many, many, many of the roads that your dad and his company built.
You have, and if you've ever had a drink of water in New York City, the water traveled through a water tunnel that they built later in the company's career. So, yeah, his fingerprints were kind of all over the area for sure.
There's something to say about that, though, when you think about when you build stuff or you're responsible for a company that builds stuff, that you can actually drive over it or see it or drink from it. There's like something left of what you did. Whereas there's other things you may do where there's some dusty old ledger that I did back when I was a 25-year-old accountant that doesn't exist anymore, or something
Sure.
like that, you know?
But what's really interesting, James, it's a very interesting point with my father because he had great pride in what he did, but he never ever dwelled on it. People would give him a book, for example, on the New York City water system, and he found it interesting on an intellectual level. Certainly proud that he was part of this continuum that had started, 130 years ago. He was not a monument builder. He would never look at something and say, "Wow, I built that," or, as he was, he had more pride in how the work got done than the fact that the work got done. So he would always, I remember driving with him past construction sites and he would make comments about the Schiavone project being very neat and tidy, and the traffic, which inevitably happens in a construction project, moved better on their sites because of their logistics versus some other contractors. That he took pride in. The fact that that road got done or that highway got built or the bridge was completed, he wasn't a monument guy. In our family, we refer to it as windshields and rearview mirrors. He wasn't a rearview mirror guy. He was absolutely a windshield guy. He would only be looking forward. And I think that's what led him to, other challenges and other things in his life where, he liked the next thing, the next opportunity. He loved to challenge himself. And he was, from close friends and family, we used to, kind of refer to his life as the Teddy Roosevelt speech. He was the man in the arena. That's what he was. Didn't criticize, didn't, wasn't woe is me, even through the trial, which is, certainly a part of his life that most people know about. He was really up for the next challenge, doing his best to try to succeed. That's really but never shying away from those challenges.
Yeah, think about you and I are pretty much the same age. So
Yep.
growing up in the 60s and the 70s, and I remember my dad coming home. He was in a carpool, so he got home the same time every night. He brought the Newark Evening News with him.
Oh, no, well,
Maybe a couple mechanical pencils from New Jersey Bell Telephone Company that made their way to our house.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
A little
Oh, yeah.
briefcase. And
Free stationery.
yes, and dad came home. We had dinner every night. What was it like during the years? Your dad was obviously building a business. He was a very dedicated, hardworking man. What was life like at home when you were growing up as a kid?
So I was born in Newark, in a hospital in Newark, St. Michael's Hospital. But we lived in Maplewood in my grandmother's house, and then in a house that they bought on Colgate Road in Maplewood before moving to Short Hills, which is really where I spent most of my time, my memories. So what do you know as a kid in the 1960s and the 1970s? You played outside until the street lights came on. That was dinner time. You came in. My mother is Italian. She is a really good cook, so there was always good food. My father would come in. Most nights he'd be there for dinner. Some nights he wasn't, just because of his work schedule. When they were preparing bids, for example, for the next job, they were typically very late nights because the bid was always due first thing in the morning. So they would be putting the last touches on a bid. But, family vacations, again, I think owing to the time, I played a lot of sports as a kid and played for a long time. I can count on one hand how many games they made, right? It wasn't today it's the Uber parent who coaches 3 sports and that wasn't happening. There were a few dedicated dads who coached every sport because they were the only ones that they could hoodwink into doing it. And so I don't think it was just a different life back then, right? So I don't think our house was any different than any other house. That's just the way it was.
I'm glad you said that, Ken, because I've talked to my wife about this quite a bit. My mom and dad were wonderful parents. I couldn't have asked for better parents. They were always there for me, but I could count on one hand, like you said, how many games my father made, my little league games. It was either, he was in a carpool, so he couldn't make it home. There weren't as many parents at those games, it seemed. I thought to myself, I know my dad loved me. I'm not sure why he wasn't at the games, but I talked to other baby boomers. It's the same thing. They weren't there that much.
Well, I'll tell you, so here's a funny anecdote on that. So you grew up the way I grew up. My sport was soccer. I played all my life up through a semi-professional level till finally my body gave up. So I went to Fairfield University in Connecticut. I went to where I met my wife. She was a very, very good student. I could kick a ball. That's pretty much the short math on that. We had a game my sophomore year, 1977. We used to have a Sunday tradition where we would go to Cosmo games at the old Meadowlands. We would go to church on Sunday and get in the car from church and drive directly there. The construction company had a box, a suite in the stadium, and we would sit there with the other company families that liked soccer, which the Callahan family in particular, and you'd eat your fried chicken and your hot dogs or whatever, and you watch games. So we kind of got my parents into watching soccer to the point where it really became a big thing for them. 1977, Pele, who was everybody's hero, he's playing his last game in the Meadowlands. I had a game that morning in Fairfield, Connecticut, and it was a big part of my life, both playing at Fairfield and watching the Cosmos. And there's no way I was going to make it to the game after my game. The construction company owned 2 helicopters. They had an air charter service. So nobody came to soccer games in 1977. I'm not sure many people come to college soccer games today. 10 o'clock game in the morning. You can imagine what a college campus is like, 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. And all of a sudden, people hear, coming down. The next day in the Bridgeport Post, and one of the parents even comes to their son's games by helicopter. And I thought the great irony is he could have driven 2 miles to watch me play for a lot of my high school career. And he gets famous for flying in a helicopter to watch one of my games. It was to pick me up to make it back to the Meadowlands in time for me to watch the Pele's last game. Great memory for me. Funny story.
Oh,
in fact, my wife, who came to no games, and we weren't dating at the time, remembers the helicopter.
who wouldn't actually? I think in our conversation we had a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned your father had kind of a mischievous sense of humor.
Yeah, very much so.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are legion of stories how he was a kind of a practical joker, I'd say, and he loved to tell stories. So I'll tell one story related to politics and then another not related. The politics story, he was flying on Air Force One with the president. And actually, one of the pictures I sent you is of this story and of that trip. He's asked to come up and have lunch with the president. It's a big honor. So he sits down. It's very tight quarters back then on that plane. So they sat together. Phone rings. This is my father telling the story. So we had a rule in the family, the 90-10 rule. 90% of what he's told was not true. You just had to figure out which part was the 90% and which part was the 10%. But he swore this one was true. The phone rings. President picks it up. First, my father tells him, of course, if that's for me, tell him I'm not here, right, on Air Force One. Part of the reason they got along is they both had a good sense of humor. The president picks up the phone. Yes. So what are my options? And my father thought, oh my God, I am witnessing history. Sitting here, the president is on the phone and asking for his options. This must be very serious. I understand. I'll have the iced tea. So he loved to tell that story. The other, a longer, and I'll try to make it as short as possible, it is the story in our family. It's the white kangaroo story. He and Ronnie Schiavone were on a business trip to Australia. This is in the early 1970s. So imagine how it's 24 hours today, long trip. They went for 4 days. They go all the way down there to look at a piece of equipment that would extrude Jersey medians for construction. Instead of having to form them, it would extrude them like Play-Doh. The machine didn't work, so the trip was kind of a bust. So it's a pretty banal reason to travel to Australia in the early 1970s. On the way home, the flight attendant comes over to them and asks, and you had to understand, Ronnie loved my father's sense of humor, but he was an engineer. It's pretty dry, and he just let my father go. So, can I get you anything? No, I'm fine. The flight attendant asked my father, so why did you go to Australia? What made you come down? So, never letting a good opportunity go to waste, instead of saying we came down to look at a piece of construction equipment, he tells her, we're actually from the Bronx Zoo, and right now in the hold of your plane, we have an albino kangaroo to bring back to the zoo. And she was, checking a manifest and wasn't really sure how this thing happened. Said, really? Oh, an albino kangaroo? And that, as soon as the hook got set, then the reeling began from this fishing tail. He said, yes, we call him Ruru. That's as good as he got on the spot. And I'm a little concerned. It's a long flight. And the only thing he eats is saltine crackers. So naturally, within minutes, there was a mountain of saltine crackers on my father's tray table to give to Ruru when they get off the plane. They land. Someone either overheard or the flight attendant knew somebody at the old Newark Evening News and gets in touch with a reporter saying, this is an incredible story. They called my father up, and it goes, he just doesn't know when to let a good thing die. Yes, it's true. We brought back this albino kangaroo, but recently my partner and I built a golf course in Bedminster, New Jersey called Fiddler's Elbow Country Club. And we are actually training the albino kangaroo to be a caddy, putting the golf clubs in the pouch. Okay. Now they want a picture of this albino kangaroo. Again, not wanting to let it die, he calls up a talent agency in New York to locate a kangaroo. Amazingly, a woman in the West Village owns a kangaroo that she leases to movie companies. You can imagine how eccentric she must have been to have a kangaroo in her apartment in the West Village. My father said, you rent him? Yes. How much is it? Whatever it was. You just have to provide a card. We will come out to your place. What color is the kangaroo? Well, it's a brownish, reddish color of a kangaroo. Ma'am, would you mind if we doused the kangaroo in talcum powder? She yells into the phone, sir, you are sick, and immediately hangs up the phone. So now he doesn't have a kangaroo. So he finally calls up the reporter and fesses up that this was, kind of a gag. The next day, because everybody knew my father's sense of humor and liked to play along, he gets a phone call. Mr. Donovan, yes, this is Inspector Jones from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We understand that you have brought a kangaroo back from Australia without putting it through quarantine. So with Mr. Jones, this was a big joke. Sir, we at the Department of Agriculture don't consider this a big joke. And then he hears laughter on the other side of the phone. It was his attorney who figured he was going to one-up the one-upping in the story. I gave you the annotated version of this. There are many sidebars to that story, but that would give you an idea of how far he would go for any gag. And it was, you have to be on alert when dealing with my father because it could come from anywhere. You had to have thick skin. You had to have thick skin.
Oh man, that sounds like so much fun. I think, did he like plant whoopee cushions around the house and stuff too?
Yeah, no, he wasn't no whoopee cushions, but there was another story where we were taking a family vacation to Wildwood, New Jersey, the typical Wildwood, New Jersey, seaside motel. The owner was, working hard to try to keep the place going, and, families coming in, kids screaming and whatever. So as distracted as he decided, well, that would be the perfect opportunity to put some fake dog poop in the guy's lobby and then complain that it was smelling. He was so convincing that the owner actually started smelling the dog manure in his lobby, had a maid come in and kind of, reach down and pick it up. It was, so he would do that. Most of his gags were, I'd say, more from his mouth than from his hands. He would play. He would love to play people that way.
Oh, I love that. Now you were talking about the president on Air Force One. That was President Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Which sort of brings us to the next section I want to talk about. So he was a family man, hard worker, and he had a great sense of humor. But he also campaigned for Ronald Reagan in the 70s. Is that true?
So my father was always very involved in politics. I suppose growing up in Bayonne, New Jersey, Hudson County, politics is, back in those days, very Irish Catholic town. And, after going to church, you talked politics. I mean, it's in everybody's blood in Hudson County. So he actually, his first exposure in politics, he worked for Adlai Stevenson, running against Dwight Eisenhower in 52 and in 56. So when he came to New Jersey, particularly in Hudson County, my father, as a very young guy, would show him around. He knew a lot of the politicians grew up around the politicians in Hudson County, so he was pretty helpful. Then Kennedy, probably as much for the Catholic relationship as any. I guess building the company and taking a break from politics through the 60s and early 70s, the next exposure for him was in 77, where at Fiddler's Elbow in that day was a corporate membership only club. It was the largest corporate club in the country. So a lot of the activities, there was no pool, there was no tennis, it was business stuff. So they had speaking series. So in 77, there was a debate that they hosted between Eugene McCarthy, who ran as a third-party candidate in 1968 and was kind of the leader of the progressive wing of the Democrats in the Senate from Minnesota, and Ronald Reagan, at that point, governor of California, who was kind of the leader of the conservative right, or the new standard bearer of the conservative right. And the debate was about the economy. I came down from college to watch the debate and talk to them afterwards, which was, an amazing experience for a young kid who was politically minded at the time. But it was my father and Ron Schiavone's real first close exposure to Ronald Reagan. So in the ensuing years, before the 1980 election, they started to try to raise money, awareness for or Governor Reagan at the time. When the campaign started off in 79, my father became the New Jersey chairman of Reagan for president. So it was throughout the primaries. He was the head of the delegation at the convention, and then worked for him during the general campaign in the fall of 80. And through that was asked to become his Secretary of Labor.
So obviously President Reagan thought very highly of your dad. Did he accept pretty readily, like pretty quickly, or did he think about it a lot? Do you know what he thought at that time?
So my father was roll back. So the Reagans had a group where Governor Reagan at the time had a group called his kitchen cabinet. There was a lot of wealthy industrial people from his travels, believed in conservative causes. He was the conservative candidate. They kind of were attracted to him. Some were friends from California. My father became kind of an ex officio member of that kitchen cabinet. So he would hear a lot of the rumors about, who's being considered for what job. He was being considered for a couple of different cabinet jobs. Transportation would be the easy one because of his experience in construction. But labor was the other one because he had a part of his job at the construction company was negotiating with a union shop. So he was negotiating with a lot of the trade unions for construction. It's funny how it may have changed today. I don't know. But literally, we were in my parents' kitchen in Short Hills, and the phone rang. I answered the phone, and Ray Donovan there, and this was after the campaign. So to some degree, he was famous in New Jersey. So yeah, you were screening calls. Yeah, may I ask who's calling? Yes, it's Ronald Reagan. It's like either this guy's doing the best Ronald Reagan impression I've ever heard, or it actually might be Ronald Reagan. I had worked as an advance man on the 80 campaign, so I worked with Reagan and Bush. So I knew it wasn't an impersonator. This was real. And so I put my father on. He asked him the question, and my father's answer was, "Of course, sir, it would be an honor." So it was that. There wasn't a lot of thinking. There wasn't a lot of politicking, running for the job. Whatever. It was really that simple. It's probably a more complex process today, but the transition group does a lot of vetting. They look into everybody's background. I mean, if my father used to joke that they know what my shoe size is and what I got in vocabulary in second grade as my grade. I mean, they do a tremendous amount. Not only the campaign, but they bring the FBI in to do background checks, and it's a very, very thorough, for the good of the country, but also to avoid political embarrassment.
Absolutely. Now, so how cool you took the phone call from Ronald Reagan. Hey, who used to do a really good Ronald Reagan impersonation was Johnny Carson.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
He was the best.
Oh, yeah. So, well, and he had Rich Little on. I'm sure Rich Little did one. And there were definitely inflections in the way he spoke that he was a good person to imitate.
Yeah. So your dad accepts this position, and that's when things start getting a little dicey. What happened then?
So the process for anybody becoming an appointed official within an administration is you have a confirmation hearing. And depending on the job, those confirmation hearings are either very quick or not so quick. For cabinet secretaries, even in those days, they weren't so quick. So they sat through, was usually sometimes it would be fast if the person was familiar to the senators doing the questioning. My father sat in front of the Labor and Human Resource Committee of the Senate for his confirmation hearing. And it was at that time that they started bringing up their suspicions of what a contractor in New Jersey was all about. And they came with a lot of preconceived notions. Ultimately, he was approved, obviously, and there was nothing more made of it. But my father's famous line from that hearing was, senators, if you're a contractor, you are suspected. If you're a contractor from New Jersey, you're indicted. And if you're an Italian contractor from New Jersey, you are convicted. And that's the way you're thinking about this. It's a comment on generally what people believe New Jersey to be. You're a lifelong resident as well. And I'm a proud New Jerseyan, and I'll defend my state to the end. It's a really good state with really good people in it. As I like to tell people, we are very direct. You may not like what we say, but we are never going to hide the truth. We will always tell you the truth.
All right.
So if that's people's view of New Jersey as a negative, so be it. I would rather know what a person is thinking than not. But I think people draw inferences from that, certainly in the construction business. Am I naive enough to believe that the construction business was all construction businesses were the way my father ran his? No, I know that, but I know the way he ran his. And after many, many investigations from the FBI, from Senate committees and the rest, nothing, absolutely nothing, until 4 years later, when things were dredged up that were ultimately shown to be nothing also. But if you go in with a suspicious mind and a political motivation, things haven't changed too much. I mean, they haven't changed from the founding of the republic to today. That's politicians who are avaricious like to use suspicion and innuendo, yellow journalism. It's been going on for forever, and in a free society, probably going to go on for a very, very long time.
Yeah. So initially there was a special prosecutor, federal prosecutor, to investigate some bribes or something like that. And then there was not enough evidence to prove anything. So
the official judgment from Mr. Silverman was insufficient credible evidence. That's the official way of saying we looked and we didn't find anything. But to show you how yellow journalism can get, Time magazine had a cover, artist's depiction of an envelope being passed from a shadowy figure, I guess my father, to another shadowy figure, whoever he was supposed to be passing it to, on the cover of a national magazine.
wow, guilty until proven innocent, right?
If you are a contractor, an Italian contractor from New Jersey, you're convicted.
Wow. So that happens. So then your dad takes on the post. He starts working as the Secretary of Labor, and he's going about his business. He's from what I've read, he was trying to carry out President Reagan's policies, which he himself supported. But then you mentioned these other charges that come up. One of the things that comes up when you Google Raymond Donovan is that he's the first serving member of cabinet of the U.S. to be indicted. So you get those charges, that footnote next to him. But ultimately, he was acquitted of all charges. But here's the thing. He's trying to carry on a very important cabinet position, but he's having to defend himself against these charges. I forget how many charges there were in the indictment, but it was a huge amount. How did that affect him at home and in his position as Secretary of Labor?
So some of it is timing. So there were two special prosecutors, and then the trial. The trial, he had resigned as Secretary of Labor before the trial itself. But throughout his tenure, he was defending himself against these charges from these special prosecutors. I believe in order to fully understand it, you have to take a step back. Both the president and my father at that time believed, as my father used to say, I am the Secretary of all labor, not just organized labor. The Department of Labor was started back in the 30s, late 20s, early 30s. Frances Perkins, first female cabinet member. And it was always kind of a voice for organized labor to the administration, whichever administration was in. The Reagan administration wanted to cut the size of the federal government, irrespective of which department, except for defense at the time. That was, and in fact, they were, I'll call them real conservatives as a degree, as opposed to being fake or real, but very conservative people who wanted to see the two newest cabinet departments, energy and education, eliminated just to save federal dollars. That was what was going on at the time. My father believed in that, but also was working for the president and tried to carry out those wishes. So he shrunk the organization, his department, significantly. Programs were cut. And you could argue the philosophy of whether they should have existed, shouldn't have existed, should have been cut, not cut. That's an honest conversation. The fact that they were cut upset people greatly, particularly those who didn't agree with the administration politically. Also at the time, Ronald Reagan, his first term was not as popular as the second term, but despite the lack of popularity, the economy wasn't quite rebounding yet. People couldn't not like Ronald Reagan. So how do you then, if you're a political opponent, how do you attack a very popular person? Well, you go after his administration. My father was absolutely the low-hanging fruit. As much of a politician or as good a political head as he had in terms of how Washington works, I think was much more trusting than he should have been with people. And so he was an easy target. And certainly being an Italian contractor from New Jersey, he was a very, very easy target. So it made doing his job very, very difficult. You're right. But I think more for political reasons than for honest philosophical reasons. He didn't lose his sense of humor during this time. He was taken on a tour of the Labor Department, which is an enormous building with a lot of people working there. Bizarre set of working rules, one of which was you could have a television at your desk, but you had to have an earphone so you didn't disturb other people. That begs the question, why do you have the television at your desk to begin with, right? And this is obviously pre-computers and everything else. So after this first official tour of the entire Labor Department, a smart Washington Post reporter figured he'd start with a gotcha question. Mr. Secretary, how many people work at the Department of Labor? My father paused for a second and he looked at the reporter and said, about half. So he never lost his sense of humor through all of it, which, God bless him. I don't know how he did it. And ultimately, the case in the Bronx, if I'm not anticipating your next question, was all about accounting. Literally. There was a statute in public works projects at the time, federal government program, where you had to allocate 10% of a job to a minority business enterprise. It was a way to spread the wealth, if you will, within construction. The problem with most minority business enterprises, even though they could be created to be a minority business enterprise, they didn't have any assets, they didn't have any equipment, they didn't have anything. They were just a company in name, which was the exact situation this job in New York, where, and it's not like there were a lot of minority business enterprises. It's not like what it is today, where you could actually bid the work. You, as a general contractor, had to go find a minority business enterprise because there weren't that many around. So they found one that was a trucking company that owned no trucks. So what do? We have trucks. We will lease you the trucks, market rate lease, and here are the trucks for the job. You complete the job. We give you the 10% of the work, but you have to pay us a market rent, not more, not less, a market rate for the job, for the lease on the trucks. Mr. Marola from the Bronx did some fast accounting and said, well, that means that Schiavone Construction Company got more than 90% of the value of that job because they received these lease payments back from this trucking company. And that's what the entire case was all about. Wow. 9-month trial and less than a few hours of deliberation. And one juror literally said this case never should have been brought.
Yeah, I read that there were jurors actually applauding.
The entire jury applauded at the end when he was acquitted. But this goes to the politics. You have a very popular, at that point, very, very popular president, and you have people trying to hurt his administration or his reputation. You can't take him on directly, so you take on others in the administration. And that's the way it's the old expression, I don't know who coined it, but if you want a friend in Washington, buy a dog. That is exactly true. I mean, it's no different today. And it wasn't different 240 years ago. And sadly, it's probably not going to be too different, for the next 100 years either. But you had a Democrat as the Bronx district attorney who had friends in Washington, and I believe that was the connection, and that's why the case was brought. Certainly what my father believed as well.
Yeah. So your father resigned from his job as the Secretary of Labor before the trial actually started then?
Correct. He resigned. He was sworn in 1981, resigned in 1985, and then the trials started soon thereafter.
Okay, that's in the Bronx. Those are
In the Bronx.
Okay,
Correct.
gotcha. And I read a famous quote from your father that as he was acquitted, he said, "Which office do I go to get my reputation back?"
That is how most people will remember my father. And I now am the president of the golf course. I'm here every day. We have a lot of members, and a week does not go by. 40 years later, that people don't come up to me and said, your father and that quote. And we're all proud of it. I mean, he wasn't a beaten man. He was a fighter. I can't imagine the combination of relief and pure rage that must have been going through him before he decided to say that. And for a kid who went to Catholic school, grammatically incorrect, by the way. But so just this past weekend, it was his third anniversary of his passing. And I remember talking to my mother about, should we put an obituary in the papers and not? And my mother is a very private person. My father, bizarrely, for all of the public persona, very private person. And my mother said, no, don't. We're not going to put an obituary. We'll let family and friends know. Well, that doesn't last too long. So I got a phone call from the Washington Post. I got a phone call from the New York Times, and inserted what I wanted in his obituary. But I think both obituaries basically started with first sitting cabinet officer to be indicted, and which office do I go to get my reputation back? If people look at that today and say there's a lesson in it and you can learn from it, I think everybody in our family would be okay with the fact that it was in there. But to define my father by one quote is very, very misplaced. He was a much larger than life character than that.
Yeah. Well, that's why we're speaking with you, to hear about who he was, what he was really like. But there's a lot of years passed since he was acquitted back in 1987 of those charges. What was the rest of your dad's life like? I think you mentioned he maintained his sense of humor beyond those years. What did he do? What was he like during those 35 or whatever years he had after that acquittal?
So start with the obvious. People would come to him for, I'm not sure advice, but at least political insight. He became very apolitical, which is completely understandable, but he wasn't like other people involved in politics that can't leave it behind. He left it behind. He came back, went back to the construction company, built the construction company back up, and ultimately it was sold to a large Spanish contractor. My siblings, we were involved at the golf course. This is what we do, and it's one of the bigger private clubs in the country. He would refer to himself as the vice president of second guessing. So he would come down here, and when we would make a decision, he would always question, "What the heck are you doing?" I always used to joke that he was really good at his job and was going to get a raise because he was a very good second guesser. So I think it was that, spending more time in Florida with my mother, ultimately moving back up to New Jersey, being with his grandkids and his great-grandchildren, my two grandchildren. So he just kind of enjoyed himself, enjoyed life. He'd come down to the club. Anytime anybody would see him here, they would want him to hold court. He had stories that just went on forever. A lot of people wanted to talk to him about his political life. He didn't shy away from it. He would talk about it. I think people were, smart enough or polite enough where they wouldn't just focus on what the obituaries focused on. And he would love to talk about it. the people that he met, and things that he did. So I mean, he had any one of the careers would have been enough, and he had all three. Plus, did immeasurable charity work. So he had a very, very full life that if you wanted to hear the stories, he'd tell you the stories, but he wouldn't be the one beating his chest telling you this is what I've done. He was the exact opposite. He believed more in the biblical definition of charity, where it's done quietly, and he doesn't have his name on buildings. That's just not what he did.
I understand. Yeah, I had read about him doing a lot of charitable work, that he had a heart for charity. And
famous story there too, James.
yeah, sure, please.
So my parents have been involved in inner city, largely Catholic education since the 1960s. My father would, raise money, donate money. My mother would literally go to these schools and, at story hour and read books to people. There was a school in Newark called St. Anne's School where they used to go, and kind of a pet school for them. It closed, and like a lot of Catholic schools have. Many years later, the principal of the school and a nun came up to my parents at another function and said, I don't know if you remember me. Oh, of course, sister, we remember you. So I don't know if you know, but one of the people, and this would describe my parents in terms of their charity to a T, as funny as the story is. So one of the students that you sponsored at the school actually became very famous. And I thought you would want to know that. So really, who is that? So when you had her at St. Anne's, her name was Dana Evans, but today she's known as Queen Latifah, to which my parents both asked the question of which country is she the queen, right? So they would never ever say, yeah, and by the way, we, this is who we put through grammar school. It was another student that they were trying to help, right? Pretty funny. I've been the beneficiary of that story because in times when I've had to make speeches about them or about the charities that my wife and I are involved in, which are inner city education charities, you can get a lot of mileage out of that story.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, I detect your father's sense of humor in you. I think you probably inherited, unless you're doing a good acting job.
No, I think humor is, hey, life is short. What other choice do you have, right? I think it's a better way to go through life. His was a legendary sense of humor, and I copy his stories. I don't have as many of original material as he does, so I'm kind of the Milton Berle of my parents' stories. I just steal.
Yeah, you were really blessed that you had your dad around till he was 92.
Yep.
So you had a lot of time with him. And I'm sure you were able to ask him a lot of stuff in all that extra time you had with him. But is there anything like today, if you could get together with him one more time, is there anything you'd like to ask him or tell him?
Yeah. So he was beyond my father. He's my closest friend, right? So we used to talk daily, multiple times a day about stuff. I mean, it could have been about business, a lot of it about business, could have been about the Yankees. It could have been about a bunch of different topics. So it is not, I'm not going to tell you it's daily, but it is not weekly that I'm in my car going home. My habit was always to pick up the phone and call him and tell him how the day went. And I find myself reaching for that phone a lot, even though it's been 3 years. Because right up till his passing, he was very much aware. He died of congestive heart failure, so his was a physical death, not mental. He was very much. He was just as sharp as he was for many, many years. So relevant. So we would talk about that stuff in terms of advice. Pretty conservative guy in not only his politics, but also in his life. And I think those are the lessons that we all learned. In fact, funny you asked the question. I just had this conversation with my own children. the other day, just, for no particular reason than just to remind them, because they well remember my father, that, that we have responsibility. We're very lucky in the family that we were born into. We're very lucky in what we have been given. With that comes a lot of responsibility. And you can't just put it on a plaque and stick it on a wall and assume that somebody's going to take a look at it. You have to be reminded of that all the time. Because of my father's education background in the seminary, a lot of his friends were his fellow seminarians, some of whom became priests. One, I thought it was very normal growing up that doesn't everybody have priests that they call Uncle Ed or Uncle Lenny, or that's who was in our house all the time. One particular priest that he was very, very close to, Father Leonard Bachman, told my father something that probably stuck with him the most. He certainly imparted it to us, and now I impart to my children and to others, other people who might be in similar circumstances. You're not going to make your children poor, right? If we're lucky, we were born into a certain family and a certain way of life, but it's not, we don't take private planes and that. I mean, it's not not our life. But the priest's advice was, even though you're not going to make your children poor, nor would you want to make your children poor, you have to give them the spirit of poverty. And it's a very, very powerful statement for a lot of people. We all want to do for our children, but there is a line that you would cross where you're going to do too much for your children. I don't agree, not my place to agree or disagree, but you see some people, a lot of times, because it's an easy topic to talk to billionaires, what are you going to do with all your money? Oh, I'm not going to give it to my kids. They're going to earn their own money. A bit draconian. I'm not sure. There's a lot you can do with that. What the Gateses have done, establishing their foundation, finding a cause that inspires, going out and trying to change the world, really noble things, right? The people who have money, whose game it is to try to just make more money, and it ultimately becomes kind of a net sum game for them, that it's not just important that they win, but someone else lose. It's a pretty shallow life. So being able to do good things, and I think that starts from the spirit of poverty, where you have empathy and you care. And it's not just writing a check, it's rolling up your sleeves, getting involved in people's lives and trying to help them. It's certainly what my wife and I do. It's certainly what my children do. They heard it from the man himself many, many times. They are reminded of it many, many times by their father.
Oh, that's wonderful. Amen to that. Ken, this has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, getting to know you, but also, getting to hear about Raymond Donovan, the whole story from his loving son. And it's been a real interesting education about who he was, what he stood for, the challenges, the huge challenges, the tremendous stress that he was under, and ultimately found innocent of everything. And then living a life where he just impacted his friends and family and continued to prosper, but most importantly, help others. So thank you, Ken. This has been a lot of fun.
For me too, James. I really appreciate the opportunity and had a great time speaking with you.
That's terrific. So I hope the rest of your day is great, and let's stay in touch, because we're fellow New Jerseyans.
Yeah, and we have to be proud of our state.
Absolutely. Okay, Ken. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, James. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at YHYS Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well and God bless.